Ibrahim على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So Alhamdulillah, all that He has allowed us to reach a session in which we will be book. This was intended to be a 3-session workshop. We were supposed to cover the rules book properly. The rule apply gain the maximum amount of benefit from a book. We talked in detail sessions. In this last session, we're going to talk about something which is very, very relevant to our book, Kalila wa Dimna, and that is how should we read imaginative literature? How should we? Before I delve into the topic, I would just like to confirm for am I audible clearly? Just a quick confirmation. Brother Abdul Wahid, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, assalamu alaikum. Yeah, I can hear you clearly.
Wa alaikum assalam. Alhamdulillah. Jayyid. Alhamdulillah. Excellent. So, as we all know, we are going to be reading Kalila wa Dimna. And Kalila wa Dimna is not an expository work. Expository works which aim to convey knowledge directly, right? They are of two types: theoretical. Is a work of imaginative literature which has an expository purpose. Yes, Kalila wa Dimna has an expository purpose. It aims to convey knowledge to us. However, not in that direct manner in which expository works convey knowledge. The Prince by Machiavelli, right? Or Machiavelli. If you read the works of Aristotle, for example, if you read, and I'm not recommending anyone to read these works, I'm just giving an example, nor am I not recommending them. But the point is, these works convey their points very directly, very clearly. On the other hand, works of imaginative literature, even though they might have an expository purpose, they aim to convey knowledge to you, they do that through the use of imaginative devices, creative devices. And Kalila wa Dimna is like that. Kalila wa Dimna falls in this category. This is the category in which fictional novels, fictional short stories, fictional plays, and poems also fall in. Poems fall into imaginative literature. So, how should we read imaginative literature? The rules that we read regarding analytical reading, most of them, which we did in the previous session, those rules were more relevant to expository works. But as you know, while you were listening to the previous session, some questions might have popped up in your mind, about analyzing problems and so on and so forth. And you might have thought, how am I going to do that with Kalila wa Dimna? It's not really a work with which I can follow all those rules. So this session, the aim of this session is to basically tell you, well, you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to follow all those rules of analytical reading, which we talked about in the previous session with Kalila wa Dimna, because those rules were more directly related to expository work. That is not an expository work. Instead, we want to tweak some of those things a little bit. We want to tweak some of those rules a little bit in order for us to read Kalila wa Dimna properly. Now, Adler, when he starts to explain how one should read imaginative literature, he says that he's going to start with negation. First, he'll tell you how not to read imaginative literature. And from that, from those things which you shouldn't do, he's going to deduce the principles of reading imaginative literature. Okay? So he says, in order to proceed by the way of to grasp the basic differences between expository and imaginative literature. These differences will explain why we cannot read a novel as if it were a philosophical argument, or a lyric as if it were a mathematical demonstration. The most obvious difference already mentioned relates to the purposes of the two kinds of writing. Expository books try to convey knowledge about experiences that the reader has had or could have. Imaginative ones try to communicate an experience itself, one that the reader can have or share only by reading. And if they succeed, they give the reader something to be enjoyed because of their diverse intentions. The two sorts of work appeal differently to the intellect and the imagination. Okay? Now, since the main purpose of an imaginative work is to communicate an experience, and of course that doesn't mean that you're not learning anything from this, right? It's important to talk about that experience. So Adler talks about it. He says we experience things through the exercise of our senses and imagination. To know anything, we must use our powers of judgment and reasoning, which are intellectual. This does not mean that we can think without using our imagination, or that sense experience is ever wholly divorced from the rational insight of reflection. The matter is only one of emphasis. Fiction appeals primarily to the imagination. Imaginative literature, in contrast to science and philosophy, which are intellectual. So he gives you now, after explaining the difference between expository and imaginative literature, and the main difference is that expository works are conveying knowledge to you directly. Imaginative works are not doing that. They're communicating experiences, and through those experiences, of course, you can gain knowledge as well. But you need to let those experiences take over, right? So the first rule is, don't try to resist the effect that a work of imaginative literature has on you. Don't try to resist the effect that a work of imaginative literature has on you. Let it affect you, right? Now, it is important to read actively, right? The best reading is the reading that we do actively, and we talked about this in detail in the first session. And we should read every work actively, whether it's an expository work or an imaginative work. When we say that you should experience and imagine, it does not mean that you should stop reading actively, you should stop paying attention to things. No, the only way you will experience it properly is by paying attention to it. So he says the reader of the former should be like a bird of prey, constantly alert, always ready to pounce. The kind of activity that is appropriate in reading poetry and fiction is not the same. So someone who is reading an expository work, someone who's reading usul al-fiqh, for example, usul al-hadith, nahu, sarf, when you're reading a work on those topics, you will be like a bird of prey, because those are expository works. You will be like a bird of prey, constantly alert, ready to pounce, right? When you're reading deeper works of usul, for example, it's going to be the same. Now, the way you read a book of usul or a book of fiqh is not the way in which you will be reading something like Kalila wa Dimna. Even though in both cases, you will be reading actively. He says then, it is a sort of passive action, if we may be allowed the expression, or better, active passion. We must act in such a way when reading a story that we let it act on us. We must allow it to move us. We must let it do whatever work it wants to do on us. We must somehow make ourselves open to it. Okay, that is very, very important. He says, we owe much to the expository literature, the philosophy, science, mathematics that has shaped the real world in which we live. But we could not live in this world if we were not able from time to time to get away from it. We do not mean that imaginative literature is always or essentially escapist. In the ordinary sense of that term, the idea is contemptible. If we must escape or greater reality, this is the reality of our inner life, of our own unique vision of the world. To discover this reality makes us happy. The experience is deeply satisfying to some part of ourselves we do not ordinarily touch. In any event, the rules of reading a great work of literary art should have as an end or goal just such a profound experience. The rules should clear away all that stops us from feeling as deeply as we possibly can. If you're reading a work of imaginative literature, you should be getting lost into it. If the characters are in a situation, you should be in a position where you could imagine yourself in such a situation or with them, right? You should be able to experience what a work of imaginative literature wants you to experience. So he says after that, the basic difference between expository and imaginative literature leads to another difference. Because of their radically diverse aims, these two kinds of writing necessarily use language differently. Of course, in expository works, language will tend to be much more outright, much more direct. Whereas in imaginative literature, you will see a lot of more use of metaphors and other creative devices, hyperbole, and so on and so forth. A writer will use these devices to sharpen meanings. Okay? So that is something which is also important to notice. So the second rule is, don't look for terms in imaginative literature. If you're reading Usul al-Fiqh, if you're reading Razi's Mahsul, if you're reading larger works of fiqh, you'll be looking for terms, fiqhi terms which you learned as a beginner. You will be looking for propositions that the faqih is making. You'll be looking for arguments that he is making. You will want to assess those arguments if you're an advanced student. But that is not how you will read Kalila wa Dimna. That is not how you will read it. In expository works, your reading is very logical. But for imaginative works, your reading needs to be creative. He quotes the poet Mark Van Doren here. He says, in poetry and in drama, the poet Mark Doren once observed, statement is one of the obscurer mediums. What a lyric poem states, for instance, cannot be found in any of its sentences. And the whole, comprising all its words and their relations to and reactions upon each other, says something that can never be confined within the straitjacket of propositions. However, that does not mean that an expository work is not trying to propose something or an argument is not being made. Of course there are. So he says here, however, imaginative literature contains elements that are analogous to terms, propositions, and arguments, analogous to them. And we will discuss them in a moment. And then he also says, of course, we can learn from imaginative literature, from poems and stories, and especially perhaps plays, but not in the same way as we are taught by scientific and philosophical books. We learn that is very important. The third rule and the last negative rule is don't criticize fiction by the standards of truth and consistency that properly apply to communication of knowledge. The truth of a good story is its verisimilitude, its intrinsic probability or plausibility. It must be a likely story, but it need not describe the facts of life or society in a manner that is verifiable by experiment or research. Centuries ago, Aristotle remarked that the standard of correctness is not the same in poetry as in politics, or in physics or psychology for that matter. Technical inaccuracies about anatomy or errors in geography or history should be criticized when the book in which they occur offers itself as a treatise on those subjects. If someone picks up Khalil Wadimna and says, why are these animals talking? Why is an owl saying this? Why is a jackal saying that? That's not the place for the criticism. If a biologist writing a work of biology were to claim that animals speak, you could criticize it. But Khalil Wadimna is a work of fiction. So what you would criticize in an expository work is not what you would criticize in an imaginative work. So he says, when we read a novel, we want a story that must be true only in the sense that it could have happened in the world of characters and events that the novelist has created and recreated in us. Okay. So he says, what do we do with the philosophical book once we have read it and understood it? We test it against the common experience that was its original inspiration, and that is its only excuse for being. We say, is this true? Have we felt this? Have we always taught this without realizing it? Is this though it was not previously? And so on and so forth. If we can answer most of these questions in the affirmative, then we are bound by the community of understanding that is between ourselves and the author. When we understand and do not disagree, we must say this is our common sense of the matter. But this is not what you do with poetry. No, it says not so with poetry. We cannot test Othello, say, against our own experience, unless we too are Moors and wedded to Venetian ladies whom we suspect of treachery. But even this, if this were so, Othello is not every Moor, and Desdemona is not every Venetian lady, and most such couples would have the good fortune not to know an Iago. All right? So those are the first three rules on which everything else about imaginative literature is going to be based. The first rule, don't resist the experience. Don't resist the effects of imaginative literature. Number two, don't look for terms, propositions, and arguments. And number three, do not criticize fiction by the standards of truth and consistency that would apply in the world outside of that fictional world. Once we've talked about the don'ts, we must talk about the do's. Okay. So firstly, whenever you're reading any work, there will be three steps, generally speaking. There will be the first step of outlining it, the second step of understanding its contents, the third step where you respond to it. Right? So once you've understood the general rules of how not to read imaginative literature, let's talk about what to do. So, how will we outline a work of imaginative literature? So, number one, you must classify a work of imaginative literature according to its kind. A lyric tells its story primarily in terms of a single emotional experience, whereas novels and plays have much more complicated plots, involving many characters, their actions, and their reactions upon one another, as well as the emotions they suffer in the process. Everyone knows, furthermore, that a play differs from a novel by reason of the fact that it narrates entirely by means of actions and speeches. So, classify your work. Is it a poem? If it's a poem, what type of poem is it? If it's a novel, what type of novel is it? If it's a play, what sort of a play is it? Khalil Wadimna is a collection of short stories which serve a didactic purpose. Number two, you must grasp the unity of the whole work. whether you have done this or not can be tested by whether you're able to express that unity in a sentence or two. The unity of an expository work resides ultimately in the main problem that it tries to solve. But with fiction, we will say the unity of fiction is also connected with the problem the author has faced, but we have seen that that problem is the attempt to convey a concrete experience. So the unity of a story is always in its plot. You have not grasped the whole story until you summarize its plot in a brief narration. So once you're done with an inspectional reading of a story, and with Kalila Udimna, of course, you have different stories, so you can divide it into like mini novels. It's a collection of short stories. So by the time you're done with the book, reading, you should be able to summarize the plots of each story within there, right? And you should be able to, because the stories have connection. There are things that connect the stories. You should be able to, in one or two sentences overall, say what the whole collection is about. Number three, you must not only reduce the whole to its simplest unity, but you must also discover how that whole is constructed out of all its parts. The parts of an expository book are concerned with parts of the whole problem. The parts of fiction are the various steps that the author takes to develop his plot, the details of characterization and incident, the way in which the parts are arranged different in the two cases. In science, it differs in the two cases. In science and philosophy, they must be ordered logically. In a story, the parts must somehow fit into a temporal scheme, a progress from a beginning through the middle to its end, to know the structure of a narrative. You must know where it begins, what it goes through, and where it comes out. You must know the various crises that lead up to the climax, where and how the climax occurs, and what happens in the aftermath. All right. And he clarifies, he says, by aftermath, we do not mean what happens after the story is over. Nobody can know that. We mean only what happens within the narrative after the climax has occurred. Okay? So those are the three rules for outlining a work of imaginative literature. Number one, classify it. Number two, mention the unity of the plot. You should be able to summarize it in a few lines. And number three, know the individual parts where it all began, the problem that happened, the different problems that happened, the things that led to the climax, and what happens after the aftermath. If you're able to do that, if you're able to put step three in a few paragraphs, you have outlined the book. You have successfully outlined the work. Now, after we outline any work, we need to interpret it. We need to understand its contents, whether it's an expository work or a work of imaginative literature. We covered the rules of interpreting expository works. What about the rules of interpreting fiction? That's what the author is going to talk about now. Number one, the elements of fiction are its episodes and incidents, its characters and their thoughts, speeches, feelings, and actions. Each of these is an element in the world the author creates. By manipulating these elements, the author tells his story. They're like the terms in logical discourse. Just as you must come to terms with an expository writer, so here you must become acquainted with the details of incident and characterization. You have not grasped a story until you're familiar with its characters, until you have lived through its events. So understanding the events properly, the characters, how they're described, that is how you will come to terms with a book of interpretive literature. That's number one. Number two, terms are connected in propositions. That is with expository works. The elements of fiction are connected by the total scene or background against which they stand out in relief. The imaginative writer, we have seen, creates a world in which his characters live, move, and have their being. The fictional analog of the rule that directs you to find the author's propositions can therefore be stated as follows. Become at home in this imaginary world. Know it as if you were an observer on the scene. Become a member of its population, willing to befriend its characters, and able to participate in its happenings. Be sympathetic by sympathetic insight, as you would do in the actions and sufferings of a friend. If you can do this, the elements of fiction will cease to be so many isolated pawns moved about mechanically on a chessboard. You will have found the connections that vitalize them into members of a living society. So once you've become aware with the main characters, the details about them, the traits that have been mentioned, the characterizations, the events that are unfolding, you now need to be a part of this world that they're in. That's how you will be able to understand it at a deeper level. Number 3, if there is any motion in an expository work, it is the movement of the argument, a logical transition from evidences and reasons to the conclusions they support. In the reading of such books, it is necessary to follow the argument, right? In fiction, what happens? You have become acquainted with the characters. You have joined them in the imaginary world wherein they dwell, consented to the laws of their society, breathed its air, tasted its food, traveled its highways. Now you must follow them through their adventures, the scene or background, the social setting. The social setting is like the proposition, a kind of static connection of the elements of fiction. The unraveling of the plot, like the arguments or reasoning, is the dynamic connection. Aristotle said that the plot is the soul of a story. It is its life. To read a story well, you must have your finger on the pulse of the narrative. Be sensitive to its very beat. Right? So he continues, he says, before leaving these fictional equivalents for the interpretive rules of reading, we must caution you not to examine the analogy too closely. An analogy of this sort is like a metaphor that will disintegrate if you press it too hard. The 3 steps we have suggested outline the way in which one becomes progressively aware of the artistic achievement of an imaginative writer. Far from spoiling your enjoyment of a novel or play, they should enable you to enrich your pleasure by knowing intimately the sources of your delight. You will not only know what you like, but also why you like it. So you understood the characters, the main events. You became apologies. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me clearly? Excellent. That's fine, inshallah. Okay, so as we were saying, so there are 3 steps to outlining an imaginative work, and then there are 3 steps for interpreting it. We've covered the 3 steps for outlining it and the 3 steps for interpreting it. Now he says here, one other caution. The foregoing rules apply mainly to novels and plays. To the extent that lyric poems have some narrative line, they apply to lyrics also. But the rules do not cease to apply to non-narrative lyrics, although the connection is much less close. A lyric is the representation of a concrete experience, just like a long story, and attempts to recreate that experience in the reader. There's a beginning, middle, and end of even the shortest lyric, just as there's a temporal sequence in any experience, no matter how brief and fleeting. And though the cast of characters may be very small in a short lyric, there is always at least one character, namely the speaker of the poem. This information is going to be valuable to us because after Kalila wa Dimna, we are going to read poetry as well. Okay, so it's important to understand that these rules of imaginative literature also apply to poetry. Now that we know how to interpret, how to outline and interpret these works, the final thing is your response to it. How do you respond to it? Third and last, what are the critical rules for reading fiction? You may remember that we distinguished in the case of expository works between the general maxims governing criticism and a number of particular points, specific critical remarks. With respect to the general maxims, the analogy can be sufficiently drawn by one translation, where in the case of expository works, the advice was not to criticize a book, not to say you agree or disagree until you can first say you understand. So here the maxim is, don't criticize imaginative writing until you fully appreciate what the author has tried to make you experience. There's an important corollary to this. The good reader, this is very important, guys, the good reader of a story does not question the world that the author creates, the world that is recreated in himself. We must grant the artist his subject, his idea, his done, said Henry James in The Art of Fiction. Our criticism is applied only to what he makes of it. That is, we must merely appreciate the fact that a writer sets his story in, say, Paris, and not object that it would have been better to set it in Minneapolis. But we have the right to criticize what he does with his Parisians and with the city itself. In other words, we must remember the obvious fact that we do not agree or disagree with fiction. We either like it or we do not. Our critical judgment in the case of expository books concern their truth, whereas in criticizing these works, what do we consider? Their beauty, right? So he says, let us restate the maxims then in the following manner. Before you express likes and dislikes, you must first be sure that you have made an honest effort to appreciate the work. By appreciation, we mean having the experience that the author tried to produce for you by working on your emotions and imaginations. Thus, you cannot appreciate a novel by reading it passively. Indeed, as we have remarked, you must read it passionately, any more than you can understand the philosophical book that way. To appreciate, to achieve appreciation, as to achieve understanding, you must read actively. This is very, very important. So, in summary, even with imaginative works, we outlined them, we classified them, we mentioned their unity. We try to understand the elements of that unity as well. Of course, those elements are going to be different. We try to interpret them as well, right? We want to understand the individual characters, the events. We want to understand the plot. We want to understand how all the things are connected together. Those are the things that we're going to use to interpret those works, the characters, their traits, characterizations, the plot itself as a whole, the events that happen. We're going to take all of that into account when we're trying to make sense of a story. And finally, when we respond to it, our response is going to be that of either like or dislike, but after fully appreciating and experiencing that story. Okay? Now here, towards the end, Adler mentions some recommendations on how to read stories. He gives some pieces of advice. I feel this is beautiful advice, and we he says the first piece of advice we would like to give you for reading a story is this: read it quickly and with total immersion. Ideally, a story should be read at one sitting. Although this is rarely possible for busy people with long novels, nevertheless, the ideal should be approximated by compressing the reading of a good story into as short a time as feasible. Otherwise, you will forget what happened, the unity of the plot will escape you, and you will be lost. Now, this point, although relevant, is going to be more helpful to us when we have read 2-3 works of fiction in Arabic. Right now, a lot of us are still at the stage of elementary reading. We're still improving. We're still working on our vocabulary. So it's completely fine that at this stage, if you're not able to read it quickly. But inshallah ta'ala, there will come a time at some point when after this reading of Kalila wa Dimna, you're going to pick it up once again. You will joyfully remember the time that inshallah ta'ala that you participated in this program, you had read the book cover to cover, and then the next time you'll be able to apply all of these rules very fast, very quickly, and you'll be able to finish the book in no time, right? But generally we say read as quickly as possible. Immerse yourself in it. Read quickly, we suggest, and with total immersion, right? Let yourself experience it. You want to understand the unity of it. He says, following this rule will allow you to answer the first question you should ask about any book. What is it about as a whole? Unless you read it quickly, you will fail to see the unit of the story. Okay? Then he says, the terms of a story, as we have observed, are its characters and incidents. You must become acquainted with them and be able to sort them out. But here a word of warning. To take War and Peace as an example, many readers start this great novel and are overwhelmed by the vast number of characters to whom they're introduced, especially since they all have strange sounding names. They soon give up on the book in the belief that they will never be able to sort out all the complicated relationships to know who is who. This is true of any big novel. And if a novel is really good, we want it to be as big as possible, right? It does not always occur to such faint-hearted readers that exactly the same thing happens to them when they move to a new town or part of a town, when they go to a new school or job, or even when they arrive at a party. They do not give up in those circumstances. They know that after a short while, individuals will begin to become visible in the mass. He says here, we also, despite the plethora of incidents, soon learn what is important. Authors generally give a good deal of help in this respect. They do not want the reader to miss what is essential in the unfolding of the plot, so they flag it in various ways. But our point is that you should not be anxious if all is not clear from the beginning. Actually, it should not be clear then. A story is like life itself. In life, we do not expect to understand events as they occur, at least with total clarity. But looking back on them, we do understand. Because all of this comes down to the same point. You must finish a story in order to be able to say that you have read it well. Okay? Then he says, the great majority of books that are read are stories of one kind or another. People who cannot read or listen to stories. We even make them up for ourselves. Fiction seems to be a necessity for human beings. Why is this? One reason why fiction is a human necessity is that it satisfies many unconscious as well as conscious needs. He says, on the simplest level, and a discussion of this subject would be very complex, we like or dislike certain kinds of people more than others, without always being sure why. If in a novel such people are rewarded or punished, we may have stronger feelings, either pro or con, about the book than it merits artistically. For example, we are often pleased when a character in a novel inherits money or otherwise comes into good fortune. However, this tends to be true only if the character is sympathetic, and so on and so forth. So, of course, try to understand the characters, the relationships between them, what the author has mentioned about them, details about their physical traits, their personality traits. You can even figure out their personality traits by the kind of things that they do in the story, and so on and so forth. A lot of this is very important for Kalila wa Dimna, because different characters will have different personality traits. Those traits will be criticized, some traits will be glorified, and of course, at the final level, you want to understand the connection of everything with the plot and how it all comes together. He then says, finally, we suspect that life as we know it is unjust. Why do good people suffer and bad ones prosper? We do not know, we cannot know. I mean, of course, they are disbelievers, so they don't really have good understandings of these things, which, alhamdulillah, we as Muslims have good answers to. But that's not the main point of this of these workshops. So I'm not criticizing some of the more un-Islamic ideas here. But the fact causes great anxiety in everyone. In stories, this chaotic and unpleasant situation is adjusted, and that is extremely satisfying to us. In stories, in novels and narrative poems and plays, justice usually does exist. People get what they deserve, and so on and so forth. He says in fiction, we must be careful to distinguish those books that satisfy our own particular unconscious needs, the ones that make us say, I like this book, although I don't really know why, from those that satisfy the deep unconscious needs of almost everybody. The latter are undoubtedly the great stories, the ones that live on and for generations and centuries and so on and so forth. Every story, for everything that you read, you will answer those 4 questions. What is a book about? What does it say in detail? What it says, is it the truth? And why is it significant? We're going to answer those questions with imaginative literature as well as you're reading it. And you will be able to answer it if you follow the steps which we have talked about in this session, the 3 steps of outlining imaginative literature, the 3 steps, the 3 rules of interpreting it, and the 1 main rule of responding to it. So in total, we have 7 rules. Inshallah ta'ala, I'm going to write them down on a document, and I will share that document by tomorrow, inshallah ta'ala. With that, we end our last and final session, inshallah ta'ala. I wanted to discuss syntopical reading as well, the last level of reading, but I realized that at this moment it is not very relevant to us, because we're not going to be engaging in syntopical reading, as we are reading literature mainly to improve our language. Therefore, I decided to omit it for now. Barakallahu feekum. So, do we have any questions? Do we have any questions, any queries, anything which are unclear? Any comments, any things you guys want to discuss? Oh, I really wish that too. One of the courses that really helped me was literature. And even though it did not teach me the stuff consciously, taking the literature course at high school level did teach me how to do many of these things subconsciously. That was one of the best courses that I ever took. But definitely, these are things which need to be taught, which would not only improve one's grades, they would really help us become lifelong learners in the best way possible. With that, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to end our session today. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.